Okay, hi. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining this panel on rural housing. In this 20-minute session, we'll hear from Senator Michelle Hinchey, Mike Borges from the Rural Housing Coalition, and Robyn Haberman from AARP. If you have any questions during the session, you can write them in the chat, and we will read a couple at the end if there's time. I'm going to recommend going into speaker view on your Zoom so you can focus on our panelists during the session. At the end of the session, we'll close this session and you'll be able to go back into the main room and select your second round of breakout rooms. So with that, I will turn it over to Senator Michelle Hinchey.
Sure. Well, thank you. And it's great to see everyone. Great to be here virtually. Thank you to Robyn and Mike too for your work in this space. Taking a step back, working with all of our rural housing advocates, in a district like mine, so now the 41st was the 46th, both really rural communities. We often think about housing crisis in our more densely populated or urban areas, when in fact, our rural communities are also facing a housing crisis and yet don't get as much of the attention or the financial supports that other areas do. And we went into the budget last year really looking to change that dynamic and shine a much bigger light on housing issues in our rural communities for our seniors, for new families who are looking to be able to start a life in maybe our more rural or suburban areas and haven't been able to do so because our housing supply is already so strangled, really, it's already so small. And so in partnership with many people, I think here in this room, we were able to get the largest investment of upstate and rural housing in the budget last year. And that included first-time funding for things like small rental development initiatives, which is building 20 units or less, right? Many of our rural communities, especially because of the infrastructure, we're not going to handle huge, massive buildings. Our rental units being built, but we do need smaller ones and to build more of that walkable community feel. And so that was a really important step. Increasing HONDA, Housing Our Neighbors with Dignity, which is the program to convert hotels and motels into affordable and supportive housing. Originally, the funding started only as New York City. We were able to expand that $100 million to be statewide. And I know in Kingston and Ulster County, RUPCO is actually accessing that money to do just that with the Old Quality Inn already, which is great. And a host of other things, but I'll add to the Restore program, which is something that we were actually able to legislate and now put in statute. And the Restore program helps our low to moderate income seniors and people with disabilities be able to afford home repairs. And but what we're seeing is many of these programs actually now are oversubscribed because the need is so great. And going into this year, it's going to be really important for us to advocate and push for even more funding and more programs that are going to be able to both expand housing in our rural communities, as well as make sure that home ownership is affordable, that renting is affordable, and that maintaining these buildings, our homes and our rental units is in reach for people who are living in our rural communities. And so I don't want to take up our whole panel. So those are just a couple of quick highlights that I think we've been able to move in the right direction, but lots more to do. I'll pass it, I think, to my other panelists, and then we can have a discussion.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this rural housing panel. I'm Mike Borges. I'm the Executive Director of the Rural Housing Coalition. We represent 57 rural preservation companies, which are nonprofit housing and community development organizations, providing an array of housing, rehab, repair, construction management services to rural communities throughout the state. I want to thank Senator Hinchey as well as Senator Kavanaugh for their support last year with our rural housing initiatives. We had a lot of success. Unfortunately, the governor rolled back a lot of that success. And so we're hoping to restore, no pun intended, a lot of the programs that were funded last year and that were left out of, unfortunately, the governor's proposed executive budget. So New York State Housing Community Renewal defines rural as communities of 25,000 or less. And there are 46 out of our 62 counties where a majority of the population resides in communities of 25,000 or less. So 74% of the counties are essentially rural. According to the 2020 census, 924 of the state's 1,023 communities, or 90% of our towns, villages, and hamlets have populations of 25,000 or less. So rural is pretty extensive when it comes to New York. We think of the major urban areas, but a lot of our geography is considered rural. Rural New York, like the state as a whole, has seen population loss. Rural New York saw a 1.3% population decline compared to a 0.7% decline in urban areas. Rural New York currently represents 21% of New York's total population, or 4.2 million people. While rural New York's population has declined, the percent of rural population 65 and over increased by 14% over a 5-year period to 18.9% of the total rural population, compared to 15.4% in urban areas. In addition, 13.5% of the rural population has a disability. Even more troubling is the 4.8% decline in the population of 18 and younger, meaning less people entering the workforce. And this was borne out in other statistics that showed a 4.7% decline in private sector jobs in rural areas, compared to a 3.8% increase in private sector jobs in urban areas. Rural housing is mainly composed of owner-occupied housing, with approximately 78% of total housing is owner-occupied. 28% of rural housing was built before 1940. Vacancy rates in rural areas are double the vacancy rates in urban areas, 18% in rural areas to 9% in urban areas. This vacancy rate can be attributed to a number of factors, including the decline in the population, the age and the quality of the housing stock, and a spike in short-term rentals. All have contributed to the decline in affordable housing options in rural communities. Mobile home communities, or parks, numbered 1,800 in 2019, when HCR, Housing Community Renewal, administered their mandated registration with the state. In 2020, Tax and Finance assumed the responsibility for this registration, and in 2022, only 1,200 were registered with the state. We don't know whether there was a 600 decline in mobile home parks, or that's just that Tax and Finance did not administer the program appropriately, but it's troubling that this option of affordable housing option for rural communities is in decline. And mobile homes represent 14% of the housing stock in rural communities, or 65,000 units. So the loss of mobile homes or parks is a significant blow to affordable housing in rural communities. The governor recently vetoed legislation sponsored by Senator Skoufis and Assemblymember Thiel, which would have improved the ability of mobile home park community residents to purchase their mobile home parks when they were for sale and there was a change of ownership. Right now, the law only allows for a right to buy, a right to purchase by residents when there is a change of use. So, change of use. So if you convert a mobile home park to a marina, then the residents of the mobile home park had an option to buy it. The legislation that was being sponsored and the governor vetoed would have made that, expanded that to include with just a change of ownership. So if you converted the mobile home park to other kinds of residents, high-end homes or, apartment buildings, whatever, that would have also triggered the right of first refusal for mobile home park residents. Mobile home communities across the state in New York are under threat from real estate speculators who purchase the mobile home parks, increase rents and fees to drive out residents, and redevelop the parks into more lucrative investments. New York needs to do more to protect this affordable housing option in rural communities. I'll now turn it over to our colleague here at Robyn from AARP, which produced a nice report on rural housing needs for senior citizens.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be part of this conversation, and I know we only have a few minutes, so I will keep it brief. My name is Robyn Haberman. I am an Associate State Director here at AARP New York. And as Mike just mentioned, we did a thorough deep dive report into rural housing issues for older adults. And here's just a few things that we do know. There are more than 1 million people aged 50 and older residing in rural New York. And in the next 2 decades, as our baby boomers are aging into their late 70s and their 80s, that number is going to increase by 65%. Right now, there's 800,000 adults aged 65 and older living in rural counties. Nearly all of them live in owned or rented houses. A third of them live alone. And what we know about older adults from survey after survey to AARP is they want to stay at home, they want to age in place. And right now, the housing security of older New Yorkers in rural parts of the state is endangered by several challenges, including poor housing options, a lack of affordable housing, which I know is a big theme you'll hear throughout this conference and all the panels, I'm sure, and barriers to creating housing alternatives like local zoning and codes. There's a lot of solutions that are needed. I think the Restore program was already mentioned. And one of the things that we are really passionate about this right now is the need for home modifications, because that's likely to increase as our housing stock ages. 28% of housing units in New York State's rural communities were built before 1940. A lot of them have not been well maintained, and few of them were built with accessibility in mind. Entryways, stairs, narrow doorways, those can make homes not a great fit for people as they age, limiting their ability to enter and exit on their own independently. And there's a large unmet need for accessibility modification. So we're looking at this New York State's Access to Home program that funds wheelchair ramps, handrails, other home modifications for people to age comfortably and safely in place. For about a decade, Access to Home has only been able to fund about 1 million in projects annually, and the requests are exceeding that by far. In 2022, this was only enough funding to benefit about 80 homes in New York, and there are so many more that could use that kind of help. 23 rural counties in New York State have not received any program funding from Access to Home since 2013. We're advocating to increase the budget for that program so that more people can take advantage of Access to Home. And we'd also love to see the eligibility expanded so that more people can get that kind of help. And I'll pause here. I am going to put a link in the chat to our full report from 2022 and my email. So if anyone wants to continue this conversation offline, I encourage you to get in touch with us. And I think we have a few minutes for Q&A if anybody has any questions.
As we wait for a question, two things I want to mention too that I think are, or I'll say three things that are really important for our communities. Of course, the Housing Access Voucher program that was mentioned at the top is something that we're pushing for in this budget, as well as including the restoration and increases of many of the programs that we had and some new ones, as Mike was talking about. But two of the issues, short-term rentals was touched on briefly, and especially for communities in the Hudson Valley and rural communities in the Hudson Valley, making sure that we're actually creating a registry for these short-term rentals and helping our small towns and cities be able to actually get a handle on what's happening. Not to say that they can't do that on their own, but they shouldn't necessarily have to pay taxpayer dollars and money that they have that they may need for infrastructure improvements or name other issue when the state could help. So we're pushing a big proposal to actually create a statewide registry for short-term rentals, as well as make more equal some of the taxing components that are there, because many of our rural communities don't have an occupancy tax, and therefore they're not actually able to get some of the revenue from these short-term rentals that are there. So we're looking to change that structure. And another big challenge in our rural communities, apologies for my friend, our cat here, one of the other challenges that we have is a shelter system in our rural communities. We don't have shelters per se. We have hotels and motels, and they're often not regulated or looked at in the same way. And so as people are trying to get back on their feet, they're trying to find somewhere to live because of our very limited housing supply. Many people are then put into these hotels and motels, which are temporary housing, and they're not really up to quality. And so something we've been working on too is how we can better support people in those moments and build more housing, create more housing, create safer housing for people as we're scaling up to have more of an increase in locations and housing stock. So there's a number of rural issues, I think, that are all conflating together that we need to get a handle on now.
Yeah, the executive budget did not have, any sort of real focus on rural New York, and which was kind of disappointing, given this is the first governor from upstate New York in about 100 years. Again, the governor has referred to her her time spending some of her childhood in a mobile home community, a mobile home park. Again, there was no real recognition of the needs of mobile home communities and the threat that they're under in New York State, as well as the whole country. We need to do more to preserve the housing stock that we do have in rural New York, as well as build new housing that's affordable. And there's lots of options available out there. Unfortunately, I don't think a lot of the governor's proposals kind of address those kinds of issues. So hopefully with the legislature, we look forward to working with Senator Hinchey and Senator Kavanaugh and others to making that a reality in the coming budget. Are there any questions from anybody? I see Kevin O'Connor has joined us. We were just talking about property tax abatements for first-time home buyers, because that's a stumbling block. You know, there's no one is building. The private sector isn't building entry-level homes, and that's a problem, because that leads to a backlog of people staying in apartments. And so with apartments being full, landlords can raise rents because there's no vacancy in those apartments, because there's no place for those people to graduate to. You know, I graduated from an apartment, bought my first home for $116,000, and there were plenty of entry-level homes available. Now entry-level homes are out of reach for people. I think more needs to be done to make the purchase of first-time entry-level homes affordable, whether it's through tax abatements like the STAR program. We have a STAR program for senior citizens, which is why we have such a large population of seniors in the state, because it's more affordable to stay in your home as a senior citizen. But there's nothing to help facilitate first-time home buyers or entry-level home purchases. Perhaps we need to extend the STAR program or some other tax abatement for first-time home buyers. The other thing I think is there's no incentive for private sector developers, you know, for any of the home builders to build entry-level homes. There's no money in it. So maybe should be some sort of tax incentives, tax credits for builders to build entry-level homes over a certain price range, you know, under a certain price range. We need to do more to get the private sector, because government can't solve all of our housing needs. We need to get the private sector involved, and we need to figure out ways to make it more affordable to buy a first entry-level home and to build more of them. So that's something I think was lacking as well in the governor's budget.
One thing I would add, if we have time to, as a big part of this conversation, is the infrastructure too. In so many of our rural communities, we don't have water infrastructure. And we have already developed corridors that should have more housing, that are primed to have housing built. But the challenges both on cost and logistics without this infrastructure is a big problem. And so we're also looking at, it's great that there's more money in the clean water grants. However, many of our smaller, more rural communities can't access that funding. They don't have grant writers on staff. The time it takes to do it and turnover is difficult. And so we're actually proposing some changes to some of the grant funding, not all of it. A lot of it is important and inaccessible, but changing some of it so that it's more of a formula base to be able to actually get to communities that need it. So then we can actually build out the water infrastructure, sewer infrastructure that's needed to be able to actually build homes in some of these rural areas, not necessarily to pushing for sprawl, but in the places that are already prime for housing developments that haven't been able to get it because of that type of cost.
Yeah, the governor did include $250 million, as we discussed earlier, Senator Hinchey, for infrastructure. But again, you know, it's the devil's in the details. How's that money going to get distributed? Can rural communities access? Because we're the ones, you know, rural communities are the ones, like I just mentioned before, we're lacking the water infrastructure, the sewer infrastructure, the roads that, you know, are commonly found in urban areas. And not to take away from their needs, but, you know, a good portion of that $250 million should be set aside specifically for rural communities so they can access that easily without going through a lot of hoops. Because you're right, they don't have the capacity to apply for a lot of these grants that are available, which is why, you know, some of these smaller programs like the Main Street program is great and geared towards smaller hamlets and villages that don't have staffing capacity to apply for larger grants like DRI or New York Forward. So, you know, we need to do more to make it easier for rural communities that don't have capacity to participate and take advantage of all the state programs that are available to them.
Another challenge we found too, and another nod to Kevin and Rupco, and I had mentioned before he'd come on about the incredible work they're doing with the Quality Inn in Kingston, really changing that and transforming that into housing. But some of our more rural communities don't have affordable housing corporations either. And so sometimes the funding that we are allocating can't even get to the community that needs it if there isn't an affordable housing corporation. So providing more funding for those organizations to be able to expand, I think is also really important. And as if we think about these types of programs in the immediate too, how do we make it easier possibly for other communities, say a Columbia County or name other county that doesn't have the ability to access that funds, but still has the same types of housing challenges that many of our other areas do. So that's something that's kind of come to light that we are kind of thinking through and working through as well.
You're right. There are chunks of New York State, rural New York, that doesn't have the rural preservation companies coverage. Schenectady County, parts of Schenectady County, Montgomery County, Warren County, Washington County, Hamilton, Herkimer counties don't have rural preservation companies, or that can access these programs and do the restore work and do the access to home work and do all the other kinds of things that these nonprofit housing organizations do to serve rural communities. And we look forward to working with you to hopefully get the money restored for the RPCs and the coalition, as well as increase the number of RPCs and the funding that they get, so they have the capacity to deliver on the state's housing programs. Yeah.
Because we know, and as we've talked about before, right, it's even much more economical to restore the housing that we have. And so we need to build more. We know we need more supply. We need to be strategic about those locations too, but we have such a great opportunity to restore the housing that does exist. And especially in our upstate rural areas, we have a lot of them. We have a lot of zombie properties. How do we get those back on the rolls and make them affordable for first-time home buyers? And there's some incredible organizations that are doing that, but we're not doing it fast enough.
Does anyone have any questions, any comments, suggestions, jokes?
I've got some bad jokes, but you don't.
That's not a bad joke unless you hear it.
I am going to take an opportunity just to throw something out there, especially for some of the smaller communities looking for funding. We have a very small AARP Livable Communities has a community grant challenge, which is a small quick action fund. Applications are now open. So I just encourage, if anybody has a really great livability project that they, if there's a nonprofit or a municipality that wants to pursue something of that nature, I encourage them to apply. It's really meant to fund projects that pack a big punch, not huge funding, but reach a lot of people in those 8 domains of livability. So I'll throw a link in the chat for that if anybody wants to check that out.
I guess I would ask in our last 2 minutes, for anyone who's on, what is the biggest housing challenge that you're facing? We've talked about, we've seen what was in the budget last year. We see what's in the first executive proposal now. Obviously, we have a lot more work to do, but is there something specific that would be helpful, especially for me as a legislator, to be able to go in and push for, the communities that you may represent?
I know we want to see the accessory dwelling units become a little more zoning friendly in a lot of parts of the state. I know that's something we, got a lot of attention last year, and I know there's a lot of work to be done to make that happen in the right way. But that's definitely something that we see as a priority.
Great.
Well, we only have 46 seconds left. Now's your time for your joke, Robyn.
Oh, okay. I'll do it if you really want. Why should you not write with a broken pencil? Anybody? There's no point.
There you go. I like that. That was funny. Kudos to you on that one.
Sorry. I always end my volunteer meetings with a bad joke. So that was
that's a good way to end our session. Thank you all for participating. Thank you, Senator Hinchey. Thank you, Robyn. Thank you for everybody else. And Kevin, we'll see you at another one.
On the other side.
Yeah,
Bye,
on the other side. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.